Having sex 2 or more times a week increases efficiency at work, resulting in a 4.5% income increase.
This is Exploring Unusual Sex, the podcast about odd stuff that helps understanding everyday matters. Our host today, from Milan, Italy, is author, journalist and personal coach Ayzad.
Welcome! In this episode we talk about sexual inclinations, bad boys, horny ghosts, politics and much more. Let's get starting, and the first topic is cuckolding. The pre-electoral campaign for the 2020 presidency of the United States is now on, burying the media and the social networks with an infinite magma of news, scandals and strategic disinformation. Just like in many other countries lately, the candidates' programs and actual qualities are not important. The very example of Trump's success oriented the entire competition toward the voters' emotionality, which is to say that most of the effort is concentrated on demolishing the public image of the opponents in any possible way. Therefore, insults are a tool as valid as anything, especially when they get creative and nasty. Among the many swear words used, especially by the most rabble-rousing right, an especially curious one stands out: cuck. A quick linguistic analysis reveals that, up to the previous North American campaign, the term was exclusively used by the pornography jargon. In fact, cuck is short for cuckold, an obsolete word that had disappeared in the 16th century and originally indicated a behavior typical of the cuckoo, who invades other species' nests, kicks the eggs out and lays its own to let the others brood them. So a cuckold is roughly the equivalent to the Latino use for horned, but with some important differences. In fact, the cuckold is not unaware of his partner's infidelity, but plays an active role in seeking mates for her, serves them, sometimes even sexually, and contributes to the couple's arousals by watching it without participating or enduring their insults. This dynamic can be played on several levels, potentially including a semi-public knowledge of a cuckold's role within special online communities, the use of explicit symbols worn by the partner, the imposition of genital cages preventing erection in masturbation, whose keys are held by her, the integration of BDSM practices where the woman plays the dominant role, and, in rare and extreme cases, the exposure to the risk of pregnancy with a lover called bull. Although there is a far less common female equivalent called cuckween, cuckoldism is characterized by powerful symbols of emasculation, deeply repugnant to anyone sharing the patriarchal and machist approach of certain politics. Not only that, but cuckold pornography very often uses interracial scenarios where a super-endowed black man celebrates his sexual superiority over the white male by seducing his woman, who, on her part, makes sure to stress her official partner's inadequacy. In spite of many studies confirming how most colored men despise such stereotypization and shun being fetishized, this fantasy narrative takes on a tragic value when it encounters the racist myth of white genocide, that is, the alleged conspiracy aiming to eradicate the Caucasian race exactly through the spreading of this sort of sex bullying.
Let me interrupt you just a sec for an important reminder. The episode notes contain all the links to the topics mentioned in the podcast, and if you want to dig deeper, you will find hundreds of further articles on the Ayzad.com website.
The cuckold subculture entered the mainstream only due to fiction. Porn plots have been co-opted by the imaginary narrative of political propaganda, brewing a counter-interest for a genre that had been very niche until then. The demand for new material by an audience looking for very specific scenarios, however, fosters the creation of tailor-made contents, and the final result is that in the collective perception, cuckolding, especially of the interracial type, feels much more common than it actually is. This phenomenon is clearly based on a special zeitgeist of social insecurity and on the pervasiveness of pornography, so much so that not only the public can understand connoisseurs' terms like beta male, widely used in this field, but that the public figures themselves can use them without being stigmatized for handling perverted and immoral notions. In the real world, however, the practice of cuckolding, and even more its fantasy, have very different meanings. Let's start by debunking the idea of this being a new deviance. The role of a young official lover can be found in numerous different cultures and ages, essentially for the same reasons why cuckolding attracts some contemporary couples. The classic interpretation claims it represents a palliative solution to erectile dysfunction or male fertility problems, so the bull becomes an extension of a legitimate partner. But there is more to it. For example, one mechanism revolves around the deresponsibilization of the male, especially in those couples who see the sex mostly in terms of penetration. The cuckold doesn't have to prove his virility, making him free from performance anxiety. Also, the horned man doesn't surrender his power at all, but plays the role of a big manipulator. To choose the bull, decide with his partner how the encounters will work, and watch her having sex allows him to hold a practically absolute control on the alleged infidelity of the woman, who is consequently disarmed of the power of emotionally wounding the male. According to the same logic, the voyeuristic pleasure of assisting to a pornographic show staged by his partner is not the most important part for the cuckold. That would be the moment when the intruder is sent away and the couple finds itself again, reaffirming the strength of their love. It is not an accident if, on their specialized online forums, the few negative stories are almost always centered on the failure of this unspoken pact. "We very satisfactorily played this game for years," we read, "but when she fell in love with a bull, I felt the world crashing over me." Finally, in those more BDSM-oriented cuckold relationships, the manipulation can take on the traits of a narcissistic extortion. Far from being a worthless inferior being, the slave is the central element of the whole scene, forcing the mistress to keep showing attention and care for the partner's conditions even during alleged punishments, which are of course pleasant for everyone. Who knows whether those politicians ever realized all of this?
The Sexual Explorers Manifesto is a global initiative to spread a healthier and more positive approach to sexuality. You can easily find it with an online search, but in the meantime, let's take a closer look at one of its 15 items. Today's one says:
Sex is a private matter, but it has social and political value. The very existence of this podcast proves that sexuality is a much broader and multifaceted phenomenon than it is commonly represented. While everyone lives their exploration in private, it does reflect on their entire world, including each person they come in contact with. To be more or less satisfied, more or less healthy, more or less ethical, respected, informed, resolved, sincere, integrated or free usually changes the way we relate to others, even outside of our erotic sphere. Sharing the wellness that derives from a serene sexuality influences society with exquisitely political effects. This is the reason why there exist groups, associations, entities and places dedicated to share, compare and popularize these topics. Using such resources doesn't take anything away from one's path, but enriches it as much as the ones of all the other explorers using them, truly for everyone's good.
This is your moment. In every episode, we pick one question among those sent to our expert at podcast@ayzad.com. So let's get writing to get an answer like this.
It looks like exploring unusual sex became the ideal place to find the answers not only to very peculiar questions, but also to pretty classic duds, like the one from Samantha without an H. I am in a very bad moment because I dumped the guy I had been together for 2 years to be with someone I must admit is the typical bad guy. My ex is a very nice person instead, and I know my choice hurt him even more. Am I a bitch, or is there some mysterious explanation? Let's diplomatically skip right to the second part of your question. There is a very good book titled The Social Dimension of Sex, whose authors put to the test many common wisdoms about sexuality by checking them out with all the scientific research available on the subject. Talking about the stereotype of a villain's appeal, it turns out that their fascinating trait is not really their transgressive behavior, but mostly how determined they are. In other words, both men and women find more arousing those partners who know what they want, clearly state it, and act to attain their goals, not in the meaning of assault, but of purposefulness and assertivity. Anyway, please consider it could have been much worse. Hybristophilia is a paraphilia that is manifested as the erotic attraction toward criminals, and along with gun fetishism, is among the few deviances which are almost exclusively typical of the female gender. To realize how many sweethearts some multi-homicide convicts have is shocking. As a rule of thumb, the more the media publicize the crime, the more fans the guy has. True monsters, like some pretty ugly serial killers, often even have sizable fan clubs. An online search will find at least one virtual dating agency specializing in finding wives for people in jail. Besides the indispensable prudence required when getting engaged with a sociopath, it only has one contraindication: the love normally fizzles out as soon as the prisoner is released. After solving this doubt too, I want to remind everyone that sex should always be a pleasure, not a problem, even when it is uncommon. However, if you are experiencing issues, I can help you as a personal coach to discover together the ideal strategy to win back your happiness in this field. You can get in touch through my website Ayzad.com, spelled Ayzad, and saying you are a listener of this podcast will earn you a 20% discount on the first session.
This episode is almost over, but we still have time to read one entry from XXX, the Dictionary of Unusual Sex, available in online bookstores everywhere, but in Italian only for the moment.
Today's entry is spectrophilia, the conviction of having sexual encounters with ghosts and supernatural entities. You are right, love. That is obviously a totally deranged idea that no sensible person could ever believe. Go figure whether anyone could take seriously, say, a woman who claims to be pregnant of a magical dove. And yet, there have been much worse cases. During the Middle Ages, for example, it was thought that nocturnal emissions were caused by female demons called succubi, where the incubi, literally meaning nightmares, were their male equivalents, especially busy around virgins and convents. Still, a couple of centuries later, the influence of evil spirits was considered the most probable cause for every sort of sex problem, and brought several witches at the stake. Ancient history? Not really. Even today, many parts of the world are plagued by coro, a collective delusion where a man claims his penis is disappearing, or even has disappeared into thin air, due to the curses of a witch or the night visit of some other spirit. The idea then spreads through the population up to the point of counting hundreds of alleged victims, who of course are actually just fine, and to the risk of lynching some poor innocent. Luckily, the cure is simple. You just have to fake a few magical gestures and everything goes back to normal. Until the next moronic superstition. And that really was it. Before leaving you with one last unusual sex fact, I want to thank you for listening and invite you to follow me on my social networks and above all on my website, Ayzad.com, which is also the ideal place to sign up for my newsletter. That way you'll get straight in your inbox new articles, reviews, invitations to events, and the notification for new podcast episodes which you can listen to and comment pretty much everywhere, like iTunes, Spotify, YouTube, Spreaker, and so on. If you liked exploring unusual sex, I would also like to invite you to fill the Tell Me About You form you can find linked in the episode notes, so you will help me make the next episodes even better and closer to your tastes. Finally, you can also lend a hand by telling your friends about this podcast and writing about it on your social networks. Thanks, and before moving on to the next episode, here's the fact I promised you. According to one study published on Nature, in every culture in the world we tend to turn our heads to the right when kissing.